The morning sun of June 4, 1942, painted the Pacific waters in deceptive tranquility as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's massive fleet approached their destiny. From the bridge of the battleship Yamato, the architect of Pearl Harbor watched his carefully orchestrated plan unfold like a deadly chess match across the vast ocean. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, cut through the waves with mechanical precision, their decks bristling with the Empire's finest aircraft and most seasoned pilots. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, hero of Pearl Harbor, stood ready aboard the Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the armada that had brought the United States Navy to its knees just 6 months prior. The confidence radiating from every Japanese officer was palpable. They had crushed the Americans at Pearl Harbor, devastated their forces in the Philippines, and now Midway Atoll would fall like a ripe fruit into their hands. Yet 300 miles away, Admiral Chester Nimitz had deployed his own pieces on this maritime chessboard. The carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the latter barely seaworthy after hasty repairs from the Battle of the Coral Sea, lurked in ambush positions northeast of Midway. Intelligence officer Joseph Rochefort had cracked the Japanese naval code, revealing Yamamoto's intentions with crystalline clarity. According to declassified naval intelligence reports from the National Archives, the American code-breaking effort known as MAGIC had intercepted and deciphered crucial Japanese communications regarding Operation MI, the assault on Midway. The Japanese strike force, designated Kido Butai under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, approached Midway with supreme confidence. 108 aircraft launched from the 4 carriers at dawn, their engines creating a thunderous symphony that echoed across the waters. Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers, Aichi Val dive bombers, and nimble Zero fighters formed a deadly aerial armada, their rising sun emblems glinting in the morning light. On Midway itself, Marine defenders braced for the inevitable assault. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon's fighters, a mixture of obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and newer Grumman Wildcats, scrambled to meet the incoming threat. The atoll's defensive positions, hastily reinforced with anti-aircraft guns and coastal batteries, represented America's last line of defense in the Central Pacific. As the Japanese bombers descended upon Midway like mechanical vultures, explosions erupted across the tiny island. Fuel dumps ignited in towering pillars of flame, barracks crumbled under the weight of high explosives, and the precious runway, Midway's lifeline, suffered devastating damage. Marine pilots fought valiantly against overwhelming odds, but the Zero fighters carved through their formations with lethal efficiency. Commander Joichi Tominaga, leading the aerial assault, radioed back to the Akagi. There is need for a second attack wave. This single transmission would prove to be the thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire Japanese battle plan. Nagumo faced a critical decision: rearm his remaining aircraft for a second strike on Midway, or prepare them with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for the American fleet that intelligence suggested might be lurking somewhere beyond the horizon. The stage was set for one of history's most decisive naval encounters, where split-second decisions would determine the fate of empires and the course of the Pacific War. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's confidence began to waver as contradictory reports flooded the Akagi's bridge. His scout planes had failed to locate the American fleet that intelligence suggested might be in the area, yet the damage to Midway required a second strike to ensure the atoll's complete neutralization. The fateful decision came at 7:30 in the morning. Rearm the second-wave aircraft with land attack bombs for another assault on Midway. Below decks, Japanese ordnance crews worked frantically to swap armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for general-purpose bombs. The hangars of all 4 carriers buzzed with activity as mechanics and armorers raced against time. Stacks of deadly ordnance littered the decks, a testament to the rushed nature of the rearming operation that violated every safety protocol in the Imperial Navy's handbook. Then, at 7:28, the nightmare scenario materialized. Scout Plane Number 4 from the cruiser tone, delayed by mechanical problems during launch, finally transmitted the message that would shatter Japanese composure. Have sighted 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Admiral Nagumo's blood ran cold. American ships meant American carriers, and American carriers meant the very fleet he had hoped to surprise and destroy. The second-wave aircraft, already being rearmed with land-attack ordnance, would now need to be rearmed again with anti-ship weapons. The precious minutes ticked by as confused orders echoed through the carrier task force. Meanwhile, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the Enterprise had received confirmation of the Japanese carrier positions from Midway-based reconnaissance aircraft. Unlike his Japanese counterpart, Spruance wasted no time in deliberation. At 7:02, he ordered the launch of his entire strike force. Every available aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet would participate in what he knew might be the war's most crucial attack. Historical records from the Naval War College indicate that Spruance's decision to launch immediately, despite being at maximum range, demonstrated exceptional tactical boldness that caught the Japanese completely off guard. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, while Lieutenant Commander John Waldron commanded 15 Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet. These obsolete aircraft, flying coffins in the eyes of many pilots, would nonetheless carry the hopes of a nation on their wings. The Yorktown, despite her battle damage, contributed her own strike force under Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced an impossible tactical situation. Their first strike force was returning from Midway, low on fuel and ammunition, requiring immediate recovery. Their second wave sat armed with the wrong ordnance for naval combat, surrounded by loose ammunition and fuel lines. Nagumo's carriers had become floating powder kegs, and he knew it. At 9:18, the first American attack arrived. Waldron's torpedo squadron from Hornet. Flying low and slow, the obsolete Devastators approached through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire and swarming Zero fighters. One by one, the American aircraft fell from the sky in burning spirals. Waldron himself died in the cocktail of his torpedo bomber, along with all but one member of his squadron. The slaughter continued as torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown met similar fates. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, led by veteran aces, methodically destroyed the slow-moving American attackers. Zero fighters dove and climbed with lethal precision, their cannon fire shredding aluminum and flesh with equal efficiency. Yet this apparent Japanese victory contained the seeds of their destruction. The low-level torpedo attacks had drawn every Zero fighter down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches completely undefended. The stage was set for the most decisive 10 minutes in naval aviation history. At exactly 10:22 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers appeared like vengeful angels above the Japanese fleet. The Enterprise Air Group had been searching for over 2 hours, fuel gauges approaching critical levels, when McCluskey spotted the white wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward to rejoin the main force. Following that telltale wake, McCluskey's 37 Dauntless dive bombers crested the cloud layer to witness a sight that would be seared into their memories forever. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers spread across the azure Pacific like sitting ducks, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. The Zero Combat Air Patrol remained at low altitude, having just finished decimating the American torpedo squadrons. "Attack! Attack!" McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio as his bombers rolled into their deadly dives. The Dauntless aircraft, their distinctive perforated dive brakes deployed, screamed downward at terminal velocity toward the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo finally grasped the magnitude of his predicament. American dive bombers were plummeting toward his flagship while his own aircraft sat helplessly on deck, wings folded, engines cold. The rearming operation had left his most powerful weapons as useless as museum pieces, and there was no time to launch them. The first bomb struck at 10:26. Lieutenant Dick Best's 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the Akagi's flight deck near the aft elevator, detonating in the hangar bay amid stacked ordnance and fuel lines. The explosion created a chain reaction that turned the ship into an inferno within minutes. Secondary detonations rocked the vessel as aviation gasoline ignited in towering columns of orange flame and black smoke. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown found the carrier Soryu. Two direct hits transformed the ship into a blazing wreck, her flight deck twisted and buckled from internal explosions. The carrier's captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, chose to go down with his ship, lashing himself to the bridge as his vessel listed heavily to port. Wartime correspondents from Time magazine later described these moments as 10 minutes that changed the course of the Pacific War, when American naval aviation proved its devastating effectiveness against capital ships. The carrier Kaga suffered perhaps the worst fate of all. Multiple bomb hits ignited massive fires that spread uncontrollably throughout the ship. Captain Jisaku Okada ordered abandon ship as explosions ripped through the hull below the waterline. The once mighty carrier, veteran of Pearl Harbor and countless Pacific victories, became a funeral pyre for hundreds of Japanese sailors and aviators. On the bridge of the Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto received the devastating reports with stoic composure, though witnesses later recalled seeing his hands tremble as he absorbed the magnitude of the disaster. 3 of his 4 fleet carriers were burning wrecks, taking with them not just ships but irreplaceable veteran pilots and experienced maintenance crews. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been steaming separately from the main group and initially escaped the American onslaught. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, determined to salvage something from the catastrophe, immediately launched a counterattack with every available aircraft. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, raced toward the American task force with vengeance burning in their hearts. The Japanese strike found the damaged Yorktown, already listing from previous battle damage sustained at Coral Sea. Despite desperate defensive fire from the carrier's escorts, Japanese bombs found their mark. The flight deck erupted in explosions as fuel and ammunition stores ignited, forcing Captain Elliot Buckmaster to order the evacuation of his ship. Yet even this small victory came at tremendous cost. Most of Hiryu's attacking aircraft were shot down by American fighters or anti-aircraft fire, further depleting Japan's dwindling pool of experienced naval aviators. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor lay burning and sinking in the Pacific swells, their proud battle flags disappearing beneath the waves forever. Rear Admiral Taman. Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier, as smoke columns from his burning sister ships darkened the horizon. A graduate of Princeton University and former naval attaché to Washington, Yamaguchi understood better than most the industrial might of America and the true implications of this disaster. Yet his samurai spirit refused to yield without extracting maximum vengeance from the enemy. "Prepare every available aircraft for attack," Yamaguchi commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had accepted his own death. The Hiryu's flight deck erupted in controlled chaos as mechanics and pilots worked with desperate efficiency. 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters represented the last offensive capability of the once mighty Kido Butai. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, despite suffering wounds from his earlier mission over Midway, insisted on leading this final strike. His aircraft still bore bullet holes from American defensive fire, and his fuel tank had been punctured. Yet he climbed into his cockpit with the determination of a warrior facing his final battle. "I will ram the largest enemy carrier if my torpedo fails to release," he declared to his fellow pilots. The second wave of Japanese attackers launched at 1:31, their engines straining as they climbed toward the American fleet. These men knew they were flying to their deaths, yet not one hesitated. The spirit of Bushido, the way of the warrior, demanded nothing less than total commitment to the emperor and the empire. Aboard the Enterprise, radar operators detected the incoming strike while it was still 50 miles away. Admiral Spruance, having recovered his own aircraft from the morning's devastating attack on the Japanese carriers, immediately launched every available fighter. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch's Fighting Squadron 3, already legends for their tactical innovations, climbed to intercept the Japanese formation. According to official U.S. Navy combat reports archived at the Naval Historical Center, the aerial battles of June 4th saw some of the most intense fighter-versus-fighter combat in Pacific War history. The air battle that followed demonstrated both the skill of Japanese pilots and the growing competence of their American counterparts. Zero fighters, nimble and maneuverable, twisted through the sky in deadly aerial ballet with Grumman Wildcats. Machine gun bullets traced bright arcs across the blue Pacific sky as pilots from two nations fought with everything they possessed. Despite taking heavy losses, several Japanese aircraft broke through the defensive screen. The crippled Yorktown, already listing and smoking from earlier damage, became their primary target. Lieutenant Tominaga's torpedoes struck the carrier amidships, flooding additional compartments and increasing her list to dangerous angles. Captain Buckmaster, who had returned to his ship to assess salvage possibilities, was forced to order abandoned ship once again. The Yorktown's destruction seemed to justify Yamaguchi's desperate gamble, but the cost had been catastrophic. Of the 24 aircraft launched from Hiryu, only 5 returned. Japan's pool of experienced carrier pilots, men who had trained for years and participated in dozens of combat missions, was bleeding away with each passing hour. Meanwhile, American search planes had finally located the Hiryu. Lieutenant Samuel Adams, flying a Dauntless from Enterprise, spotted the lone Japanese carrier attempting to flee northward. His radio crackled to life. One enemy carrier, course north, speed 25 knots, position 100 miles northwest of our force. Admiral Spruance wasted no time. Every available dive bomber from Enterprise was armed and launched for what would be the final carrier duel of the Battle of Midway. 24 dauntless aircraft led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher climbed into the afternoon sky with grim determination. At 5:03, the American dive bombers found their target. The Hiryu, alone and defiant, continued northward as her combat air patrol rose to meet the attackers. Zero fighters and dauntless dive bombers clashed in the skies above the last Japanese carrier, but the outcome was inevitable. 4 direct bomb hits transformed the Hiryu into a burning wreck within minutes. Admiral Yamaguchi, true to the samurai code, chose to go down with his ship rather than face the dishonor of defeat. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto faced the most devastating defeat in Japanese naval history. From the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, the architect of Pearl Harbor surveyed reports that read like a catalog of catastrophe. 4 fleet carriers sunk or sinking, over 300 aircraft destroyed, and thousands of irreplaceable veteran pilots dead or missing. The magnitude of the disaster became clear as surviving ships reported their losses. The Akagi, flagship of the Kido Butai and veteran of Pearl Harbor, had burned throughout the afternoon before Captain Taijiro Aoki ordered her scuttling by destroyer torpedoes. The Kaga had exploded and sunk in the early evening, taking Captain Jisaku Okada and 800 men to the bottom. The Soryu had capsized at 7:13, her captain choosing to die with his ship in accordance with ancient naval tradition. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the Pearl Harbor hero who had been grounded by illness and forced to witness the battle from the Akagi's bridge, later described the scene as a nightmare of fire and steel. Wounded in the carrier's final moments, he was among the last to leave the burning ship, his face reflecting the anguish of a warrior who had witnessed the destruction of everything he held sacred. Yamamoto's staff urged retreat, but the admiral's strategic mind still sought victory from the jaws of defeat. His surface fleet, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, remained largely intact. Perhaps a night engagement could salvage something from this disaster. The Americans, drunk with victory and low on fuel, might be vulnerable to a surface attack under cover of darkness. Yet Yamamoto's intelligence officers painted a grim picture of American capabilities. Admiral Spruance had withdrawn his carriers to the east, beyond the range of Japanese surface forces, while maintaining air cover over Midway. Any approach to the atoll would face coordinated attacks from both carrier-based and land-based aircraft throughout the following day. Declassified Japanese naval records from the Imperial War Museum reveal that Yamamoto seriously considered a surface bombardment of Midway despite the loss of his carriers, believing that capturing the atoll might offset the day's catastrophic losses. The human cost of the defeat extended far beyond mere numbers. Japan had lost not just ships, but the cream of her naval aviation. Pilots who had trained for 5 years or more, men who could not be replaced in the shortened time frame that war demanded. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Hashiguchi, one of the Navy's most experienced dive bomber pilots, had perished with the Kaga. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, torpedo squadron leader extraordinaire, was missing and presumed dead after the attack on Yorktown. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, rescued from the burning Akagi by the destroyer Nowaki, sat in stunned silence as the magnitude of his tactical failures became apparent. The man who had led the successful attack on Pearl Harbor now bore responsibility for the worst defeat in Japanese naval history. His decision to rearm aircraft for a second strike on Midway, then change course again when American ships were spotted, had left his carriers vulnerable at the crucial moment. On the American side, Admiral Chester Nimitz received victory reports with characteristic restraint, yet privately understood the battle's historic significance. The Japanese had gambled everything on a decisive battle and lost catastrophically. Their advance across the Pacific had been not merely stopped but reversed, and the initiative in the Pacific War had shifted permanently to American hands. The wounded Yorktown, abandoned and listing heavily, drifted through the night like a ghost ship. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's crew had fought valiantly to save their vessel, but the cumulative damage from Coral Sea and Midway proved too much for even the most determined damage control efforts. The carrier that had helped win the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War would not live to see another dawn. As midnight approached, Yamamoto finally accepted the inevitable. Operation MI, the assault on Midway, had failed completely. The Japanese fleet would withdraw, leaving American forces in control of the Central Pacific and the strategic initiative that would ultimately lead to Tokyo Bay. The morning of June 5, 1942, revealed the full scope of American victory and Japanese catastrophe. Smoke still rose from oil slicks where proud aircraft carriers had met their end, while debris fields stretched across miles of Pacific waters. Admiral Raymond Spruance, now in tactical command of American forces, faced the delicate task of consolidating his victory without risking unnecessary losses to his remaining carriers. The damaged Yorktown presented both opportunity and danger. Captain Buckmaster had returned aboard with a salvage crew, hoping to save the historic carrier that had participated in both Coral Sea and Midway. Slowly, painfully, the ship's list was being corrected as pumps fought the incoming water. For precious hours, it seemed the valiant carrier might yet be saved. Meanwhile, Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been prowling the waters east of Midway when sonar operators detected American ships. Through his periscope, Tanabe observed the crippled Yorktown and her escorts, a target too valuable to ignore, despite the risks. At dawn on June 6th, Tanabe's submarine achieved perfect firing position. 4 torpedoes raced through the crystal-clear Pacific waters toward the American task force. 2 struck the Yorktown amidships, opening massive holes in her hull and destroying the salvage efforts that had consumed 2 days of backbreaking labor. The 3rd torpedo found the destroyer Hammond, breaking her back and sinking her with devastating speed. Captain Buckmaster, who had hoped against hope to save his ship, now faced the inevitable. The Yorktown, veteran of countless battles and symbol of American resilience, would join her Japanese counterparts on the Pacific floor. At dawn on June 7th, the carrier rolled over and sank stern first, her battle flag flying proudly until the waves claimed it forever. Contemporary reports from naval intelligence, as documented in the official records of the Union and Confederate navies, emphasized that despite Yorktown's loss, the strategic victory at Midway remained complete and decisive. Admiral Yamamoto's withdrawal became a funeral procession for Japanese naval aviation. The surviving pilots from his decimated air groups flew their aircraft to bases in the Marshall Islands, many crash landing due to fuel exhaustion or battle damage. Maintenance crews that had serviced carriers for years now found themselves without ships, their specialized skills suddenly useless in a war that demanded rapid adaptation. The human cost of defeat weighed heavily on Japanese survivors. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, recovering from wounds suffered aboard the burning Akagi, would later write that June 4th marked the beginning of our end. The confident pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor were dead or scattered, replaced by inexperienced teenagers who lacked the years of training that had made their predecessors so formidable. Perhaps most significantly, the industrial implications of Midway became apparent in the weeks following the battle. America's shipyards were launching new carriers at an unprecedented rate, the Essex-class vessels that would dominate Pacific skies for the remainder of the war. Japan, meanwhile, faced the impossible task of replacing 4 fleet carriers and their entire air groups while simultaneously defending an overextended empire. The psychological impact proved equally devastating. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had suffered a clear, undeniable defeat. The myth of invincibility that had propelled the Emperor's forces across the Pacific lay shattered like the flight decks of sunken carriers. Morale throughout the combined fleet plummeted as news of the disaster spread despite official censorship. On Midway itself, Marine defenders surveyed the damage from Japanese bombing with grim satisfaction. Their tiny atoll had withstood the storm and served as the anvil upon which Japanese naval power was broken. The runway, hastily repaired, would soon host American bombers ranging across the Central Pacific in search of Japanese targets. Admiral Spruance, meanwhile, demonstrated the tactical wisdom that would make him one of America's greatest naval commanders. Rather than pursue the retreating Japanese fleet into uncertain waters, he consolidated his victory and prepared for the next phase of Pacific operations. The Battle of Midway was over, but the Pacific War would continue for 3 more bloody years. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the naval balance of power in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. The Battle of Midway, fought over 4 days in early June 1942, marked not just a tactical victory, but a strategic revolution that would echo through the remainder of World War II. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing battle reports from his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood that America had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return to the defensive posture that had characterized the war's early months. The mathematics of defeat told a stark story for Imperial Japan. 4 fleet carriers, representing nearly half of their entire force, lay on the Pacific floor along with over 300 aircraft and their irreplaceable pilots. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been the steel backbone of Japanese naval aviation, veterans of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, Darwin, and Rabaul. Their destruction created a gap in Japanese capabilities that no amount of industrial effort could quickly fill. More devastating than the material losses was the human cost. Japan had lost the cream of her naval aviation in a single day. Pilots like Lieutenant Commander Takashi Hashiguchi, whose bombing accuracy was legendary throughout the combined fleet, and Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, whose final attack despite mortal wounds epitomized the samurai spirit. These men represented 5 to 7 years of intensive training that the empire could no longer afford in a war of industrial attrition. Post-war analyses by the Strategic Bombing Survey, as documented in official Department of Defense historical records, concluded that Midway represented the decisive turning point of the Pacific War, after which Japanese forces never again seized the strategic initiative. The ripple effects of Midway extended far beyond the immediate battle. Operation FS, the planned assault on Fiji and Samoa, was quietly canceled, as Japan lacked the carrier aviation necessary to support such an ambitious campaign. The isolation of Australia, a key Japanese strategic objective, became impossible without the fleet carriers that now rested beneath Pacific waters. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant architect of Pearl Harbor, found his strategic vision fundamentally altered by the catastrophe at Midway. The quick, decisive victory that might have forced American peace negotiations had instead handed the United States an overwhelming propaganda triumph. President Franklin Roosevelt's radio address to the nation on June 8th spoke of a glorious victory that proves American fighting men are second to none in courage, skill, and determination. The industrial implications became clearer with each passing month. American shipyards, operating at unprecedented capacity, launched new Essex-class carriers that dwarfed their predecessors in both size and capability. The Intrepid, Hornet, Yorktown II, and dozens of others would carry the war to Japan's doorstep. Meanwhile, Japanese yards struggled to replace even a fraction of their Midway losses, while simultaneously supporting Army operations in China, Burma, and the Southwest Pacific. Perhaps most significantly, Midway demonstrated the decisive importance of intelligence in modern naval warfare. The American code-breaking triumph that revealed Operation MI in advance proved that technological advantage could overcome numerical inferiority. Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo had handed Admiral Nimitz the equivalent of reading Yamamoto's private correspondence, allowing perfect positioning of American forces for maximum effect. The battle also marked the emergence of dive bombing as the dominant form of naval attack. The devastating accuracy demonstrated by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's Enterprise Air Group and Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Yorktown squadrons proved that properly trained dive bomber pilots could penetrate any defense. The age of the battleship as the primary capital ship ended definitively in the 10 minutes between 10:22 and 10:32 on June 4th. For the Japanese people, carefully shielded from news of the defeat by military censorship, Midway remained a victory for months to come. Official communiques spoke of successful attacks on enemy positions and the sinking of American carriers. Only gradually did the truth filter through Japanese society, contributing to a growing war weariness that would characterize the empire's final years. The strategic initiative, once firmly in Japanese hands, had passed permanently to American forces. Future battles would be fought at times and places of American choosing, with Japanese forces increasingly relegated to defensive positions on fortified islands. The road to Tokyo Bay began at Midway, where 4 aircraft carriers and their proud crews made the ultimate sacrifice for their emperor, only to see their deaths mark the beginning of their empire's end. The seas that had blazed with burning carriers on June 4th would soon carry American task forces westward toward the heart of the Japanese Empire, fulfilling Admiral Yamamoto's prophetic warning about awakening a sleeping giant.